Hey guys, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to Total War Warhammer 2, and today is part 4 of my sponsored series of army guides on all of the playable factions in the sequel to last year's hit title Total War Warhammer. Today I'm going to be looking at all of the units that make up the Dark Elves, a sadistic faction hell-bent on murder and slavery. And by the end of it, you'll know the difference between your Blackguard, your Executioners, the scantily clad Witch Elves, and even some of the larger beasts, such as this Hydra, and also one of my favorites, the Black Dragon. So without further ado, let's get started. So firstly, let's take a look at the two heroes of the Dark Elf army. Number 1, Malekith. Malekith is the Witch King of Naggaroth and argues himself to be the true heir of Anarion. He is filled with nothing but malice and hate, especially for his brethren, the High Elves. And in Total War Warhammer 2, he's very proficient in both melee combat and also as a spellcaster. Malekith is equipped with a series of war gear. Firstly, his sword, the Destroyer. Inside Total War Warhammer 2, the Destroyer increases the rechargeability of all spellcasters around him within a 40-meter radius. He is also wearing the Circlet of Iron, which increases the chance that all spellcasters will miscast, and it is map wide. And finally, Malekith is equipped with the Supreme Spell Shield, which decreases the power reserves of spellcasters within 40 meters of him. And so this makes Malekith one of the best units in the game for countering enemy spellcasters. And while Teclis is certainly a mighty wizard, he is no match for Malekith if he has a full set of gear on him. And while great as a countercaster, Malekith is also a very proficient spellcaster within his own right. His Gaze of Malice will destroy enemies within a cone of area in front of him. He has an amazing ability called Blade Wind, which just mows down entire units, but watch out as it's very unpredictable with its pathing. And his Doombolt ability has a small strike area, but it's great at taking on single powerful lords or heroes. Next up, he has an ability called Chill Wind, which affects a large area and slows down enemies. And it's very useful to also just fire it off into his melee combat to inflict some splash damage. If you find yourself running out of a little bit of juice, he's got the Power of Darkness as well, which will increase his magic reserves, but watch out as it will drain his hit points. But if you want to just top your hit points up a little bit off the enemy lord, then use Soul Stealer. And as we can see on the left-hand corner, you're going to be able to get your hit points back rather nicely indeed. But if providing support to your other units is more your kind of thing, then he does have the Word of Pain ability as well. This will reduce the unit's melee attack and also their accuracy, which can make them incredibly weak in melee combat. And it's also got an exceptionally long duration of 40 seconds. All in all, Malekith was one of my favorite spellcasters in the game, capable of just dominating entire units if used in the correct way. But if the prospect of fighting Malekith on foot was not terrifying enough, he can also fly into battle on the back of a Black Dragon named Sephiron. The Dark Elves also seem to like to keep it in the family, and that's because the other lord in the Dark Elf campaign is Morothy. The Hag Sorceress of Gorond is also the mother of Malekith, and she is one of the most powerful magic users in the world of Warhammer. Morothy is dedicated to pushing the success of her son Malekith, and inside Total War Warhammer 2, she is equipped with Heartrender, a magical staff for which she is so skilled that she's able to pluck a victim's heart from their chest with a single blow. And what's the saying, hands don't lie? Well, that might give you an idea of just how old and powerful this hag is. Morothy has access to some of the most destructive spells I've ever encountered in a Total War game. Check out Pit of Shades. Look how long range this is. We're talking about 200 meters. You can nail it on your opponents from afar, and the result is, yeah, quite a lot of dead elves. Just like Malekith, if you found that you've used up a little bit too much of her power reserves, then she can use Power of Darkness to be able to regain them, but you will take damage for this. And also, like Malekith, she has the ability Soul Stealer, which is awesome for sapping the life out of the enemy lords and also regaining your health that maybe you turned into some excess magic. She has an ability called Doom of Darkness, which will decrease the leadership of her opponents, and also Soul Blight, which will decrease their armor and also their weapon damage, which can be very useful if you want to try and keep her alive while she's outnumbered. She also has an ability called Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma, which not only deals damage to combatants, but also slows them down by 24%, which can be very useful if you're wanting to get away from something, or alternatively, if you want your cavalry to mow them down. Later on in the campaign, you can unlock Sulfet, a dark Pegasus for Morothy to fly upon. This increases increases her speed, dramatically allows her to run rings around her opponents and just dump spells on them all day long. But be careful, because Morothy's armor is limited, as well as her melee attack and melee defense, and so she's not going to hold up all that long against very elite units. So now let's take a look at some of the melee infantry that compose the mainstay of the Dark Elves army. Firstly, the Bleak Swords. The Bleak Swords are quite expensive for a standard unit, but their statistics more than make up for it, being very well rounded. They're also shielded as well, which will provide them some protection against some small arms fire. And while they're not going to be winning any awards for being unique or having some kind of special ability, their well-rounded nature and their ability to clock up your murderous prowess ability with both their kills and also when they die can be a great way to power up some of your other more elite units. If you're going to be handling larger units, of course you want to be equipped with a spear instead, and the Dread Spears are the anti-large units for the Dark Elves. And while they're going to deal significantly less damage than your Bleak Swords, they're much more resilient with 33% more melee defense and also a charge defense against large foes. They're also very cheap, just like the Bleak Swords. They're a great way to power up your murderous prowess ability and to protect some of your more vulnerable units. Now let's look at the Black Ark Corsairs. These Druchii certainly have their sea legs, and they're one of the most fearsome units within the Dark Elf army. Just look at the upgrade over the Bleak Swords. We're talking about 50 more armor, they're faster, they hit harder, and they've also got a little bit of charge bonus. And as they're anti-infantry, they're great against anything smaller than a horse, and they've also got a Sea Dragon Cloak, which is the secret to why they've got 80 armor, yet they're really fast with a base speed of 40. Black Ark Corsairs are absolutely perfect for crashing into the non-armored, non-armor piercing units on the enemy, and if you manage to connect them correctly into things like clan rats, these guys are going to be taking out hundreds with a single unit. However, as I said at the start of this video, the Dark Elves are sadistic, and none more so than the Witch Elves. These Witch Elves sacrifice all protection. Look at that 5 armor. Yeah, and it's pretty obvious why these witches only have 5 armor on the battlefield. But with this massive sacrifice of armor, just look how much better they are than the Black Ark Corsairs. They've got better leadership, better speed, melee attack, weapon strength, and charge bonus. And like the Black Ark Corsairs, they're anti-infantry. Anything smaller than a horse is going to get cut up very quickly by these witches. And they've also got an ability called Madness of Cain, a poison type ability which reduces the unit's melee defense by 10% and 24% speed. It will also afflict the enemy with Rampage, which will make them uncontrollable, forcing them to wipe out the Witch Elves or die trying. And finally, the Witch Elves have got the Dodge ability, which helps them to avoid blades and missiles with ease. However, if these scantily clad hags are not quite your thing and you'd rather be donned in a full suit of armor, then maybe the Har-Ganeth Executioners will be a more attractive proposition. And just look how they compare to the Black Ark Corsairs. Just everything is better about this unit, and you have to pay for it as well. This is a very expensive melee unit that is hard to maintain unless you've got a good economy. These Executioners have got fantastic armor, 110 to be exact, making them one of the most well-armored units inside Total War Warhammer 2. They've also got incredible leadership. They've got better melee attack, better melee defense, better weapon strength, and better charge bonus than the Dark Ark Corsairs. But all of this armor certainly does weigh them down, and that speed statistic drops all the way down to 31. But the key advantage that the Har-Ganeth Executioners have is that they're both armor piercing and anti-infantry as well, which means that while it might take these golden masked demons a little while to get into the combat, when they get there, they're pretty much able to take all comers. While these Executioners are completely and utterly badass, the title of the most elite Druchii, however, stays with the Blackguard. These halberd-wielding Dark Elves are the personal bodyguard of Malekith, and their statistics show it. They're more healthy than the Executioners, they've got better leadership, they've got better melee defense, and their weapon strength is also slightly higher. But they do lose some charge bonus, but as they're using halberds, they are anti-large, which makes the Blackguards one of the best units in the entire game at handling those monstrous units. Next up, the ranged units inside the Dark Elf army. Firstly, the Dark Shards. Now, these archers are fairly long range at 125, but their key ability is the fact that they are armor piercing, which makes them very proficient at taking on units which are usually hard to take out at a distance. My favorite thing about the Dark Shards is they're cheap, and their crossbows force heavily armored and usually slow units to have to attack you. And this means that you can break their formation and take on a tough nut to crack. Dark Shards come in two varieties, your standard and also with shield. And I think the shield is worth that little bit of extra gold because it allows the Dark Shards to be resilient against non-armor piercing ranged units. So they don't get taken out quickly because their range and their missile damage is not as impressive as some of the other ranged infantry of the game. However, if you want something a little bit more elite, then the Black Arc Corsairs are available, and as we can see, they're just a definitive upgrade over the Dark Shards in nearly every way apart from range. And also, it should be clarified that these units are not armor piercing like the Dark Shards, and so they're very good against non-armored units. The best thing about the Black Arc Corsairs, however, is they're very fast with a base speed of 40, and they can fire on the move with their hand bows, and so they can run rings around their opponents and whittle them down before they even reach the melee combat. But if they do reach the melee combat, they're still way more proficient than most ranged units. And unlike some of the skinks that the lizardmen have, they've got a decent amount of ammunition. And so they can quite often pick apart maybe half the hit points off a standard melee unit, even a shielded one, before they reach your army. Next up, let's take a look at the shades, of which there are 3 different variety. Your standard shades, shades with dual weapons, and also there are shades with great swords as well. Now all 3 varieties of shades have got vanguard deployment, which will allow them to get close to the enemy lines before the battle has even begun. And when we compare them to the Dark Shards, we can see that the shades are better in every single way, while still maintaining those armor-piercing missiles from their crossbows, which means that later on in the campaign, you just want to replace all of your Dark Shards with shades. But what kind of shade is going to be best to take? Do you want to take your standard shades? Or is it worth upgrading to take dual weapons? What does the dual weapons do? Well, the dual weapons basically mean that the shades are now anti-infantry inside the melee combat, and they've also got a little bit more melee defense as well. Or alternatively, you can equip your shades with great swords. With great swords, your shades will have less melee defense than they would with dual weapons, but look, their weapon strength goes up, and they also gain an armor-piercing ability, which means that it doesn't matter how heavily armored the opposing army is. I absolutely love the shades. Their vanguard deployment allows you to get stuck in really quickly, and they've also got a stalk ability, which means that they can move hidden in any terrain, and so until they fire, they can really get some good ambush shots off. One thing I like to do as well is just toggle off that skirmish mode and then charge them into combat. And with those great swords, which they will unwield after they're done with their hand bows, or shall I say their crossbows, they can be very proficient indeed, which makes the Shades one of the most diverse and also flexible units within the Druchii army. Next up, Cavalry, and the Dark Elves have got quite a variety available to them. Firstly, the Dark Riders. While these might not be the most elite horsemen, they're ludicrously fast at 92 base speed. They get vanguard deployment, and also you can equip shields on them as well if you want them to avoid some missile fire. The Dark Riders are best used to hound down enemy ranged units or to try and charge the flank or the rear of an enemy that is locked in melee combat, but don't expect them to perform very well when they're there, as their base statistics are quite poor. Their armor is low, and they don't have any anti-infantry, anti-large or armor-piercing capabilities. For that, you're going to have to look towards the Cold One Knights, which as we can see are significantly better than the Dark Riders in pretty much every way, having triple the armor, 50% more leadership, which will make them not run away as quickly, better melee defense, better weapon strength, better charge bonus. They're also anti-large as they're using spears, and they're also armor-piercing. And it's quite nice to have anti-large cavalry to be able to get to that monstrous unit before it's able to do too much damage. But one downside to the Cold Ones is they do have primal instincts, which means that once they're under pressure, they may go to a rampage, attack the nearest enemy unit, and just ignore your orders altogether. And just like the Lizardmen, it can be immensely frustrating to see your elite cavalry locked in combat in a non-favorable position. However, there is an upgraded version of the Cold One Knights, Cold One Dread Knights, with 30 more armor, 14 more melee attack. That is significant. 10 extra melee defense and weapon strength as well, but they do lose some charge bonus. And also one thing to watch out for is as they are using these kind of hand axes now, instead of spears, they're no longer anti-large, and just like with the regular Cold One Knights, they've got primal instincts, and so if they're under pressure, they're going to stay in the combat that they were in. However, these Cold One Dread Knights are absolutely monstrous, and if you can get them to charge into combat against anything that doesn't have armor-piercing capabilities, they're pretty much going going to win the melee combat the vast majority of the times. There's little better in Total War games than combining the advantage of having a ranged weapon with the speed of a cavalry unit. And the Dark Riders with repeater crossbows do exactly that. Now, while they might not have as much range as the Dark Shards, they still have armor-piercing missiles, and they can deliver that ranged fire more effectively on the battlefield using ludicrous speed. This allows your Dark Riders to advance quickly towards where they're needed, avoid enemy engagements from melee, and deliver effective ranged fire, even into kind of melee situations like this. And then if you absolutely need to, you can charge them in, maybe into the rear of the enemy or in their flank, if the melee combat isn't quite going your way, and sometimes that can cause the moral bars on the enemy team to drop to a point where they're going to rout, run away, and then you've got all the advantages of that speed to be able to catch them. But just be careful, because their armor, unlike your Dread Knights, is really, really low. They're also not very good with regards to their melee defense and their melee attack. So after a charge, it's quite often the best thing to do is to pull them back and reshoot at range. And then if the enemies decide to stay there anyway, well, you can just charge back in. The Dark Elves also have an exceptional chariot available at their disposal, the Cold One Chariot. It's armored with 110 base armor. It's armor piercing, both with regards to its missile damage and also its weapon damage if you want to charge it into combat, and it's anti-infantry. And with 125 range and 102 armor piercing missile damage, these guys can just be very flexible in the majority of situations. And after you've softened up the enemy at long range, then it can be very fun indeed to charge in and let your scythes do the work for the rest. Moving on, the Dark Elves have Harpies at their disposal, and it looks like they're doing some kind of coordinated dance right about now. Harpies are kind of like a lightly armored cavalry unit. They've got a base armor of 15. That's not great. They're very, very fast, however, with a base speed of 82. Their base leadership, however, is very low at 52, so that's something to watch out for, that unless things go their way or they're surrounded by other units or your lord, then they're likely to run away. When they do get into the combat, however, they don't really have the best attack at 22, but their weapon strength is decent at 44. Personally, for me, the Harpies are one of my least favorite units inside the Dark Elf roster, and are exceptionally vulnerable to ranged fire, and I personally preferred the cavalry or even the ranged cavalry to take on the enemy ranged units. But then again, the Harpies might be quite good against artillery, so if the enemy are putting some kind of a turtle defense against you, you might want to take a couple. Just like the High Elves, the Dark Elves have only got one artillery unit available to them. It is the Reaper Bolt Thrower, and kind of a copy-paste here. Like the High Elves, it has two fire modes. Your standard round, which has got a bonus against large units and also has armor-piercing damage, but if you choose, you can choose the multi-shot round. You're going to lose the majority of your armor piercing damage. You're also going to not have a bonus against large, but you've got a bonus against infantry instead. And so this means that micromanagement of what kind of rounds you're going to be firing with your bolt throwers will be key to their success. So now let's take a look at the two monstrous units available inside the Druchii roster. Firstly, the War Hydra. The War Hydra has amazing weapon strength at 440, and it's armor piercing as well. But the key to the War Hydra's success is that the rest of its statistics are fairly well rounded, but it has key abilities like regeneration, which means that whenever it's not taking damage, the War Hydra is slowly regaining its hit points. It also has scaly skin, which helps to dampen or deflect the missile damage caused by your opponents. The War Hydra also causes terror, which will force the enemy to rout for a short time, and it's got fiery breath as well. Fiery breath has 3 uses, has a 90-meter projectile range, and can be very useful for softening up things before they manage to reach combat. Whoa, look at that! Half health off there. Those 3 uses have got a 45-second cooldown in between, and so if you're so inclined, you could actually just kite the enemy units for just under a minute to be able to regenerate it and soften them up a little bit more before you get into combat. But against units like these High Elf Spearmen, you don't even need to worry about that. One of the best abilities that the War Hydra has is called Another Takes its place. And this means that when the hit points of the War Hydra reaches 50%, it will literally grow another head and regain a significant portion of its hit points. This, combined with the regeneration capabilities of the War Hydra, make them one of the most resilient monstrous units in the game. And when I'm playing through the Dark Elf campaign, they're kind of my go-to unit for when you just want to throw something at the enemy because maybe you just don't have an answer. The Dark Elves also have a dragon at their disposal. In this case, it's a black dragon. And if you've watched my High Elf army guide and you want to know how a black dragon stacks up compared to the 3 dragons, the sun, the moon, the stars that are available available to the High Elves, the Black Dragon is very similar to a Moon Dragon. And while it has a little bit less leadership, its armor is significantly better than the Moon Dragon at a base of 80. And in fact, its armor is equal to that of a Star Dragon. But all of you High Elf fans out there will be thrilled by the fact that the Star Dragon is still the daddy in the game. And while the Black Dragon might not be quite as good as its older brethren in the form of the Star Dragon, it's by no means a bad unit, and you can use its noxious breath ability to be able to soften up your opponents, just like with the War Hydra before you close the distance and engage them in combat. And just like with all of the other monstrous units in the game, there's nothing quite like watching a dragon go to town in combat. And sometimes I just love to zoom all the way in and watch it up close and personal. The scale of Total War Warhammer 2 is one of my favorite things about the game. And so there you have it. The Dark Elves are sure to be a fan favorite with the more violent of you out there who love to deal as much damage as they take and get bonuses for doing so. I hope you enjoyed this video, or maybe it was just useful to you. If it was, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it. And if you want to check out my series of other army guides on the other factions, then I'll put a playlist in the comments down below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.